How's it going? Adam Drake here, and I was recently asked, how do you know when it's time for a new chassis? And I think that varies or depends on the races you have coming up, your skill level, so on and so forth. But I just want to give like a few general things to look for so that you kind of know when it is time to change your chassis. So the tracks here in Southern California, when they're watered, the tracks aren't super abrasive. It's pretty easy on tires and easy on chassis. But we also do have a decent amount of small rocks in the dirt. So when the tracks are run dry, they can become very abrasive. So hard on tires and also hard on chassis. So I have a couple chassis here. You can see they're pretty much almost all silver on bottom. They don't really have much anodizing left on them. I don't really worry anything at all as far as if the anodizing is still on the chassis. But what I do worry about is the thickness of the chassis in the back and also the thickness of the chassis under the droop screws. Because what can happen, especially with some of the newer cars, the chassis are actually cut and angled where the droop screws go to be able to allow more droop. And what happens is, so you already have it machined on the top, and then as it starts to wear from the bottom, that becomes really thin. And with the Mugen car, the area for the droop screws, there's quite a bit of meat and material. So we don't really worry about those ears bending, but I have seen on some cars where there's not as much material there and you actually can like land on a rock, and if this is really thin, it'll actually bend that tab and then also change your overall droop. So you will want to be mindful of that, making sure that the area where the droop screws go, that the droop screw is still able to kind of sit on the chassis so that you have consistent and proper droop. But like I was saying, on the back, you want to make sure that there's still enough chassis and also the D-block, that the D-block pill doesn't pull through the D-block. For me, I don't really have a set amount of time for when I change my chassis because, again, it really depends on the conditions of the track. Some tracks, like recently we were at LCRC for the Mugen Challenge, and the surface there is actually really easy on your chassis. Now, if the track ends up being dry for an extended period of time, it's going to become more abrasive. But a track like LCRC is typically pretty easy on the chassis. This is my chassis from LCRC. I believe I also raced it maybe one other race before going to LCRC. So you can see there's still a lot of the anodizing and there's very little wear on the chassis. But you'll want to change the chassis when it's starting to get really thin in the back, starting to get to where the D block is starting to wear into the pill. Or also if you've had like a really big crash or impact, you want to always make sure that the chassis is not tweaked or bent. But for the most part, you're going to try to get as much life out of the chassis as you can and run it until it gets really thin in the back. I've even run chassis so far to where the pocketing on the top where the ring gear goes and then the back of the chassis wears to where it becomes a hole and you can see the ring gear all the way through. Now, that's more for my practice car where I'm just kind of burning a lot of tanks and, you know, if I'm going to a big race, obviously I'm going to have a much newer or fresher chassis. For me, I like the feeling of my car with a fresh chassis. A fresh chassis is going to be a little bit stiffer. As the chassis wears, it gets thinner. There's going to be a little bit more flex. So maybe if you're running on a track that's going to be extremely bumpy or low grip, maybe you like the feel of your car with the thinner chassis. But for me, the newer chassis, I feel, is just a little bit more precise and crisp feeling. So you just want to, again, pay attention to the droop screw area and also the back of the chassis. And when it gets super thin, it's time to replace it.